half. Totally up to you. Thanks, Alex, for the reminder. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, just learn a little bit about everybody. And in the meantime, I'm going to switch to the next slides and hand it over to Terry Campbell with Sustainable Northwest Wood and co-founder of Sustainable Building Week to help kick us off.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So yeah, my name is Terry Campbell, one of the co-founders of Sustainable Building Week. And our goal with Sustainable Building Week, it's a grassroots, all volunteer effort, is to really do a couple of things. One, provide a lot of education to the building design, construction, manufacturing industry in Portland. And then also provide some opportunity for folks to connect across disciplines, because the way we see it is to address a lot of these environmental and social challenges that sort of threaten our way of life. We really need to break down the silos between professions and really start a lot more cross-disciplinary thinking and problem solving. So feel free during the week, the 2 weeks, to go and visit any of these other events, even if it's outside of your current profession. There's always sort of something to learn from what other folks are doing. And this year we moved everything to an online platform. And so we've stretched it out over the 2 weeks, as you can see on the calendar here. And so it's going to be a great couple of weeks, and just look forward to hearing your feedback. SustainableBuildingWeek.com is the website. You can sign up for our newsletter there. We only send out correspondence maybe half dozen times a year. And all of the presentations that are going to be recorded, which we're kind of asking most folks are going to be to record them, are going to be up and available on the website after. So if you miss something, it should be reposited on the website. Thank you again, Alex, for that reminder. So next slide, if you could there, just to talk over some of our sponsors. For this year, we had a really nice array of sponsors from architecture firms, Malum, Henneberry Eddy, Holst, Bora, and then some other companies in the sort of building space like Green Hammer and PAE, and then a nonprofit called Associated Builders and Contractors of the Pacific Northwest, a few material suppliers, Sustainable Northwest Wood and E-Terriers, PGE, New Buildings Institute, and then at the 11th hour, Brightworks. Sorry, their logo isn't up here, but they are a top level sponsor. So next slide, please, Amanda. And then these are all of our collaborators. What makes Sustainable Building Week unique is we look out to the professional groups in Portland who are already hosting events, and we ask them to host an event during the same week in October, make it about sustainable design, construction, equity, resilience, and then make them available to all of us. So these are all of those collaborating groups. So thanks to this really star-studded group of professionals here that are making this policy hopefully a reality in the future. Have a great Sustainable Building Week. We'll see you on the internet, I guess they say. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. And I was not able to launch the poll. So Terry, I'm just gonna ask if you will check and see if you have the ability to launch the poll. And so we will hopefully launch the poll soon. Keep an eye out.
I just launched it.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Terry. Okay, so please, go ahead and respond to that poll, and I'll just kind of roll through some of these introductory slides. Here's our basic agenda. We're going to cover goals, introduction, do a little bit of grounding. Then we're going to talk a little bit about this program, where it started, what are some of the things that have happened to date, and talk about some of the current context. Then we're also going to look at some high-level draft criteria and some information that we've started to look at based on some input we've received to date. And then we will go ahead and finish up looking forward and seeing where we go from here, what the roadmap looks like, how we all start to collaborate moving forward. So the program itself is called Sustainable Buildings for All. I know a number of folks on this call know it as it was previously called Living Building Pilot Program. As inspired by the Seattle program, we have renamed it for a number of reasons, which will kind of come up throughout the presentation, so I won't cover that here, but just so you know, it's the same group, same initiative, just some adjustments in how we're set up and structured. So just to touch real quick on our goals, and you'll see these again later, that are informing the program. We're really looking to accelerate transformational climate action in the city of Portland, center on regenerative environmental justice, focused heavily on equity and racial justice in the work that we're doing. Looking for results, restorative health for humans and for the environment. And then also, maintaining, building on that sustainability reputation that Portland has as it is, but continuing to build that out with kind of a more holistic view, especially with centering on equity and racial justice, as you've seen in the climate action plan and a lot of the work that's come out of the city already. So here, I'm just gonna let our core team do some quick introductions. If we wanna start with Alex and then go Ante, Kevin, Paul, Stephen, I'll close us out before I switch slides.
Sure. So my name is Alex Setmeyer, and I am a project manager and materials specialist at Brightworks Sustainability here in our Portland office. And I am really excited to be part of this initiative and working with this core team and our steering committee and all of you, because I really believe that we can encourage more buildings to achieve higher levels of sustainability and really achieve our climate action plan and equity goals in our city through a program like this that encourages buildings to just reach for that next level and make it there. So really excited about being part of this work with you.
And I'm Ante Vollen. I'm a sustainability consultant at GLUMAC here in Portland, and a Grant High graduate and a Portland resident who cares deeply about helping the city, walk the walk, and hopefully demonstrating the leadership that, many of the people on this call even exemplify. We just want the whole city to be able to do that and get some better buildings in the process.
Kevin, I think you're on mute.
Hi, Kevin Kellogg. I'm with Hacienda CDC, Director of Real Estate. We build affordable housing and economic development projects, including the Portland Mercado. I've been very honored to be on this committee. I'm the newest arrival. I bring the equity scorecard that we carry very deeply in our organization, and I've been very excited to see how much it's been embraced as part of this criteria.
Hello, I'm Paul Vanderford. I'm the Green Markets Program Director at Sustainable Northwest, based here in Portland. Work with green building projects and wood product supply chains, mostly around the Pacific Northwest. I'm really excited that this work is in my own backyard, in a place that I care deeply about. Also, I am most excited by the approach that we're taking, and that we have folks that care deeply and understand issues of equity. Groups that we've intentionally reached out to represent those issues, as well as environmental conservation, working hand in hand with folks that are interested in development. To have folks from those different disciplines together talking about solutions that work back and forth make me feel like what we come up with will be used, because the people that will be using it are at the table now. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to our conversation.
And I'm Stephen Goodman. I work for a local real estate company called Downtown Development Group. And I'm excited about the opportunity to work on the Sustainable Buildings for All program, because it's a great opportunity to address, two important issues, which are climate change and social justice. I'm born and raised in Portland, care a lot about this city, and want to see us be a leader on both those fronts.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And I am Amanda Ingmeyer. I am an architect and policy analyst at Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And I just kind of want to second everything that everyone else has said. I won't repeat it all because I absolutely agree. The one thing I will add, something that makes me really passionate about this project is seeing firsthand the power of a program like this. In order to bring, more projects, more teams, more people to the table to do this kind of development. I was fortunate enough to be project architect on a senior housing project in Seattle that a number of people on the call worked on. Alex, who you just heard from, David Webb, who's at SRG, and Jamie Krieger, who's still working on the project at Ingmeyer. It's senior housing, an incredibly intensive building type. That's now going to be one of the first senior housing LBC projects in the world, and all of that because of a program like this. So just, seeing the potential of a program like this to bring more projects to the table is really powerful. And so I also want to just introduce our steering committee members. I won't go through those of us you've already heard from, but some other folks who have been at the table: Biohabitats, Colas Construction, Girding Eadlin, Greenhammer, NAMAC, which is the National Association of Minority Contractors, OAMI, the Oregon Association of Minority Entrepreneurs, PAE, Radler, White Parks, Alexander, Attorneys at Law, Skanska, SRG, Sustainable Northwest Wood, you heard from Terry earlier as well, Walsh Construction, and ZGF. And of course, there's even a larger list of coalition members who've been with us from day one 3 years ago up until, folks who have joined within the past several months. So we're really excited to share with you what we've been working on, where we're headed in the future, and just a huge thank you to everyone who's been a part of it so far and who's interested in getting involved moving forward. So I'll do a couple slides here just to kind of ground us in the context of where we are right now in the world, and why those things apply to the work that we're doing here. So first, we'll begin by acknowledging the original people of this land, as well as their descendants who are still on this land. So Multnomah County, and for anyone who's not an Oregon resident, is where Portland's located. Multnomah County rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Calumet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. So it's important, as we discuss a policy related to the built environment, that we acknowledge the colonialism that has brought non-Native people to reside on this land, and our responsibility in this work to learn from and collaborate with Portland's Native communities in the development of a program that is just and restorative. Also, we see the effects of climate change all around us. Many of us were stuck in our homes for a week and a half due to the wildfire smoke and some of the worst air pollution in the world a few weeks ago. And the IPCC has made it clear that we need to cut carbon emissions by nearly half by 2030 and to zero by 2050. And we're not on track right now. So as the UN states in their recent report called Human Costs of Disasters, and I'm going to quote them here, "It is baffling that we willingly and knowingly continue to sow the seeds of our own destruction, despite the science and evidence that we are turning our only home into an uninhabitable hell for millions of people." That kind of struck me when I read it. And so it really hits home why some of this work is so important. And buildings are responsible for almost 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 34% of our sector-based emissions here in Oregon. So as the creators of the built environment, it is a huge responsibility that we have to take on in drawing down emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. Incremental change is no longer a viable strategy. We're at a point where we need transformational change. Also, as everyone on the call well knows, the built environment has a major impact on our health as well as the health of our environment. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, the kind that scientists have warned we can expect to see more frequently due to climate change. We spend 90% of our time indoors, and we still often find that our buildings are filled with materials that are made of chemicals that are known to cause respiratory issues, neurological issues, cancer, other things. We also have industrial facilities, sometimes making these materials, sometimes making other materials that emit toxins into the environment. And these disproportionately affect frontline communities. Most often those are communities of color and other low-income communities. Additionally, we have disproportionate investment and disinvestment that has led to aging infrastructure, creating unsafe drinking water like what we saw in Flint. And once again, this is concentrated primarily in low-income neighborhoods or communities of color. And systemic racism exists across the US and around the world. The built environment is part of the same racist system and policies that have enabled, excuse me, that have enabled continued disproportionate police brutality against Black people. Portland has been a worldwide leader in sustainability, but the benefits of this commitment have not been equitably available to and accessible by all Portlanders. In fact, systemic racism in policies and planning, redlining, urban renewal, disinvestment have led to communities of color bearing the greatest burdens of climate change, the health impacts, as well as economic injustice. And I'm going to quote again, this time Desiree Williams-Raji, as she wrote in Paul's People's Plan. In Portland, sustainability has become synonymous with whiteness, privilege, and exclusion. If we're going to create a program moving forward that incentivizes sustainable buildings for all, emphasizing the for all part of the renaming, this work will have to reject white supremacist culture and will have to be actively anti-racist, centering the voices and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And you heard some of our members speak earlier about our extensive outreach, and that is still ongoing. Will be through the whole project, but we want to make sure that all voices are at the table representing all of Portland. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ante.
Thanks, Amanda. So I've my great honor today get to talk a little bit about some of the context of this effort and how it led us to where we are today. So the first thing I want to talk about is this actually, even before this timeline on here started, as kind of an exploration of about policies that were blocking living buildings or high performance green building in Portland. And by 2016, what some of us had found is there really weren't any like hard obstacles. The city was flexible, the state was flexible on a lot of the things that you need to see really high performing buildings. And what the local ILFI collaborative realized back then was that, okay, well, there's not a lot of obstacles. What we might have now is we might need some nudges to keep things moving forward. And so over the ensuing years, that primarily starting with the collaborative and then bringing in more collaborators, we started talking to the city, talking to people in the building industry and stakeholders. Just trying to get more sense of like, hey, why aren't we seeing more green buildings? Is it something about the market? Is it something about the codes? And what can we get things to push it over the edge? And so there's been a lot of communication back and forth in an all volunteer effort. So I think that's kind of what extends the timeline on this. We're all just motivated professionals. But what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is that people are pushing progressive projects. Right at the beginning of that period, the June Key Delta Community Center had opened, showing that you could have a net zero energy community center building in Portland. The Malum Architects opened their LBC pedal office recently, and then the PAE living building is going forward. So we know these buildings are possible, and it's just the question is starting to emerge is what's a policy that can help us get more of these buildings that do the things that we say that we want. And one thing I could have put on here is the ILFI released a policy toolkit, I think back in 2018. That's a really great reference for people who want to see, what do policy approaches to promoting like deeply sustainable buildings look like? And then in true Portland fashion, though, we weren't satisfied with that, and we really wanted to find our own approach to it. So we can go next slide, Amanda. So just to summarize some of the feedback that we've gotten, I think ultimately this needs to be championed, and to find a champion with the mayor, the city council, I think we need to have something worth championing that's supported by the community, that's not just an isolated policy change, but enjoys some pretty broad support. Other things we've heard is that, you know, the city's priorities are shifting. We're really trying to make up for some inaction and negative action related to equity, and that policies that take steps to correct that are going to be looked at more favorably. There's a lot of support for the idea of a pilot. So we're not saying this is going to be around forever or this is the fixed version, but we want to find something that's kind of an experiment, a living experiment. We also heard really good feedback about not putting too much of a burden on the city in terms of expertise or administration. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit, about third-party verification and how that creates value for both the city and for us, to making a simple kind of policy program. And then we heard that, you know, obviously avoiding direct financial outlay from the city is important. And so that's something that, you know, we create some interesting constraints that different programs try to address in different ways. And then talking to other parts of the community, we heard a lot of feedback that people think that, you know, if you have a really good building, maybe design review or permitting could be faster, or maybe some of the systems development charges that you pay in a new project could be deferred or reduced, so that you're working towards the city goals. Maybe this is one way that the city could support you. There's interest in incentives that are either financial, things that create value that could be reflected to help improve the business case for a building. And then I think for things that might require some code exceptions, a pretty strong agreement from the city or other authorities having jurisdiction that you're going to be able to move forward with something that's not just typical practice. And so with those ideas in mind that we've heard from our community, we kind of started looking at some of the regulatory environment that we might be trying to change and interact with. And so first, there's the things you have to do, right? The building codes, some of the local green building requirements in the central city about green roofs or bird safe construction, that are often, you know, very contentious when they're set. So that was one thing. We're not trying to change the code immediately, you know, we're looking at a voluntary effort. And then looking at some of the changes coming, right? The state executive orders about addressing climate change, moving Oregon towards net zero emissions, that are going to start directing state agencies to make the rule changes that are going to then become regulatory changes. And then also the city of Portland and other municipalities' climate emergency declarations, you know, official recognition that, how Amanda summed up earlier, like we are in a really critical decade of delivery for making some major changes on climate change. And then in that regulatory context, there's also more open-ended goals or plans that don't have quite the same force of law. Can you just click forward one time, Amanda? So like there's Portland's climate action plan that sets these goals about emissions reductions. And so there's the great statistic that we're probably down 40% in per capita emissions since 1990. And a lot of that was on the building side. So that's a really strong improvement for our communities. And then other plan changes like the design overlay zone amendments that are going to try to find some way to get more of the buildings that we want in our communities. And then, you know, the city has policies that don't necessarily trickle down to every single project in Portland. Then there's long-term planning like the Central City Plan. And then there's commitments, professional commitments. So outside of, say, a government thing, but things like the AIA 2030 commitment that Amanda alluded to, where we as an industry have kind of started to articulate, this is where we are working towards. And then the last part of this context we're working in is incentives. So there's a couple incentives out there now. So one is the planned development bonus. So this is a great example of the city of Portland kind of took this on their own. They said for a certain number of projects that have to go through a planned development review, we're going to give you the opportunity to build a larger building if you can show you're meeting really stringent energy efficiency standards. And so that was kind of the city of Portland dipping its toe into this kind of incentives. And so we're excited to see how many projects to go pursue that and what we can learn from how that's been rolled out. There's also cash incentives from the Energy Trust of Oregon. So projects that save a lot of energy can recoup some of that investment through this state program. It's very popular, but we're trying to find out if it's enough to really move the needles for some of these really sustainable buildings. And then the last one that's on here is maybe not a traditional incentive, but the Portland Clean Energy Fund. That's the voter-approved program that sets up a tax to create a funding stream for investments that support both clean energy and equity in our communities. Now, what's interesting about that is first, it's funded. We think that's awesome. You know, we don't necessarily are not pursuing a way to fund anything, but we think there's a lot of potential synergies between this pot of money and buildings that are truly going to, be deeply sustainable and improve the equity in our communities. And I would say the other thing is the PSEF is really more open-ended than some things that here on the building industry we're used to dealing with. It's kind of, you write an application, it gets reviewed by a committee, it's competitive. So it's very open-ended and can support a broad number of potential projects, whereas we're operating a little bit more in this idea of a building project specifically. So it's a really awesome thing, and it's another thing that's kind of happening in parallel with that process I laid out before. So that's the context that we're operating in. And the thing that we're really then trying to understand is, what are some of our tools to get there? So we've heard really, that third parties standards are great because it takes this burden of the city off of being an expert or a policeman and kind of puts it onto some outside agencies. And so we looked, in the building industry, we look at certifications to provide that credibility. And so we looked at some of the major green building certifications and how they lined up with some of those deep goals that we see in Portland's climate action plan, that we see in our own group's goals. And not surprisingly, we saw Living Building Challenge, for example, having a huge overlap with a lot of those goals. That said, many of these rating systems have the opportunity to be a huge tool about operational energy and operational emissions impact. So there's a lot of different potential tools out there to get us towards our goals. And I think one thing we'll be looking forward to in this process going forward is that we want to get feedback about people about how they see these rating systems potentially overlap with their values. So we also looked at how the other cities are adapting that, and two things really just jumped out of us. People, they like tiers. They like having, a flexible set of options for projects to pursue. And both in the sense that you're going to reserve your best incentive for projects that are going to deliver the highest level of performance, but that you also lock in a baseline, and you can kind of communicate through that baseline, like, this is where you show you are serious about sustainability enough to get an incentive. And we see that in places like Seattle, which has a very living building focused program. They've got a range of options to even pursue the same incentive. In Shoreline, Washington, it's more of a tiers where they actually draw from a lot of rating systems. And then in Arlington, Virginia, they really kind of tie it to LEED, and then can add in some additional things for net zero. So we like that tier incentive, and we're still kind of thinking about how does that fit into Portland and what creates the most value for Portland. And the other thing we're trying to think about is what does success look like? So Seattle's had this program for a while, and this is their kind of plot of how many buildings they've had participate. I think it started with the Bullitt Center and then moved into another building, and it was low participation for a number of years. And so they've been tweaking their program. That's kind of why we like the idea of pilot, is that we can adjust, we can evolve, and ultimately tweak to something where you start to see that growth. And that's, I think, a question we would want to pose that I think that Amanda just dropped into the chat is, what is success for Portland if we're promoting green buildings? If we come up with an incentive and 100 buildings immediately jump on it and take it up, did that mean we made it too easy? Or does that mean that's exactly what we want? We want 100 buildings participating in this program. So it's a question that we're spending a lot of time wrangling with. We'd love to, have people share their thoughts in the chat or follow up with us later. So that's kind of where we've gotten to today.
Thanks, Ante. And I will take over here sharing about what we've drafted so far for the pilot program and where we're at. So just to start again with the goals that Amanda shared at the beginning, we want to create a sustainable buildings policy for all. We really want to make sure that it's something that accelerates climate action, so making sure that we're looking holistically at how we can encourage buildings to move the needle on climate action, how we can holistically make sure that all building projects that are participating in this program are doing something to make a difference for environmental justice, to remedy some of the problems that we've seen from systemic racism that has really been affecting the development of Portland as a equitable city for all in the past. The third thing that we want to address is human health, again, to make sure that the buildings that are a part of this program are going to be healthy for people in the future and are not propagating materials that are cancer causing or have terrible air quality or are otherwise, really negatively burdening the city, our citizens, and our health system. And the fourth thing is that Portland has a reputation of being a leader in addressing climate action, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to do that, continuing to be that. And I think that there's been conversation in our community over the last decade about how maybe Portland is falling behind, and that's not something that we want to do or be known for. So how can this policy help us continue to walk the walk, as Ante mentioned in the beginning, and really demonstrate that leadership for all of these important issues? And Amanda is dropping slides of additional questions in the chat for each of these slides, and we would love it if you could start to review. Oh, and we also have a checking in poll, so I'll give you 1 second to reply to that. And we'll ask Terry to help us share the results of these polls when we get to the conversation portion of our presentation. Okay, so what criteria have we drafted? We are looking at tiers, and we have been looking at the certification programs, mainly the ILFI programs and LEED Platinum. We are still determining with our steering committee, what tier structure we want to propose and what the requirements are within that, and what the bottom tier looks like. Because we know that the top tier, we want the best building possible. And so our criteria is organizing around those program goals: climate, equity. Amanda, you can just put them all up on that and I'll talk through them. Health and resilience. All towards that goal still of acting on climate change, equity, health, resilience, and leadership for our community. And we are still refining the actual tier performance levels for each of these criteria. But with climate in that category, we want to make sure we're addressing operational carbon and embodied carbon, and that we're pushing our building stock towards electrification so that as our grid becomes cleaner, so will the energy that our buildings are using be. So we're eliminating fossil fuels as much as possible. From the equity perspective, we're focused in workforce development, contract equity, so building on PCEF, minimum wage requirements, and the City of Portland workforce training and hiring programs, and as well as just minority business contracting, as well as including community engagement to make sure that we're capturing community benefits in these projects and providing that equitable access to air, sunlight, waterways, healthy food, really building towards the equitable community that we want Portland to be. On the health side, we're looking at materials and indoor air quality for human health. We're also looking at environmental health and waste diversion. And then on the resilience side, looking at how we can include requirements to ensure energy resilience, drinking water, and access to food. We know that the big earthquake is coming, so it's important that we include resiliency measures in a holistic, forward-thinking policy program. The questions that we have around this, because again, we're looking at tiers, we're looking at what the performance criteria would be. We're trying to understand in the tiers, what, how low should we start and how high should we shoot, so that we're achieving the goals that Ante was asking about, of measuring success. Is it that we want all buildings to be doing just a little bit more, or is it that we want all buildings to be reaching as high as they can and getting more buildings to that super, super high level of sustainability? So we welcome your thoughts on that. And I can go to the next slide, Amanda. And so we'll be developing this with our steering committee and then sharing that out, and Amanda will go into the details about our looking forward steps a little bit in a few minutes.
Yeah, and actually, Alex, there's a couple questions relative to this slide. So I wanted to pause for a second, and do we want to answer those now, or should we answer them in the chat? And do you want to keep rolling with the next slide?
I think let's keep rolling, okay, and then we can have a conversation.
Great, yeah.
But yeah, keep inserting your comments or questions into the chat. We love that, and we'll be saving the chat so we can really incorporate it into our follow-up notes. And then with our steering committee, we asked them about what kind of incentives would make this policy successful. So we're asking you to shoot for the stars, or we're asking you to do something specific. What do you need in order to achieve the performance criteria that we're asking for that would make it worth it for you to go to that extra mile? And so we through a series of events, actually a few years ago, we started asking about what different types of incentives there could be, because as Ante mentioned, you know, we have that financial constraint of it can't all just be we're going to give the projects money, because we're limited in how much money, you know, is on the table to be given out. And we then revisit this with our steering committee and ask them to map their thoughts from lowest impact incentives to highest impact incentives. And we have them noted here from zoning, permitting, financial, that would make it worth it. So on the lowest impact side, we see lot coverage, delayed or deferred SDC charges, cash rebates to cover the costs of registration certification for these programs. And on the highest impact side, we see tax abatement, SDC waivers or credits, and a carbon credit, expedited permitting. We've heard a lot about that. And municipal advocate and permitting assistance. And then in the middle, we see requirements for parking reduction, height bonus, FAR bonus, and then having some exceptions for design review and zoning code. So Amanda's asked a question too of what incentives do you think are appropriate to encourage more sustainable and equitable development? We'd love to get your feedback on this as we start to dig deeper into what's possible and align what incentives would be applied to what types of performance achievements in our tier structure that we're working on. And now I'll hand it back to Amanda.
Thanks, Alex. So here is the quick feedback poll, which you have all seen. And I think, is it closed now? Hopefully. If not, let's go ahead and close it, Terry, and then we can look at those results here in a bit. Thank you. And so then what we have next is our open discussion. So I think we can start to look at some of the questions we got in the chat. So I'll start at, I think the first one I saw, Annalie. How are you planning on covering energy needs through renewables? Obviously, there isn't enough space on site. So are you going to incentivize PPAs? And, you know, I can certainly take a crack at this, but energy is totally in Ante's wheelhouse. So Ante, if you want to take that, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm happy to.
Sure. So I'm having some slight Zoom difficulties.
Yeah.
I think part of those rating systems go to renewable energy in different ways. So for example, for like living building certification, you have to show that you're meeting your net positive, and that could be through a mixture of on-site or off-site renewables. So that's one way we'd point to those kind of certifications. And then there's, you know, other buildings like other rating systems like LEED just say like, hey, can you provide a certain percentage of your power through on-site renewables, things like that. So that's, I think, one thing we definitely want feedback on is what's the most meaningful to the community in terms of net zero versus some renewables versus you even say like purchasing or working through the utility for sure. There's all kinds of things we want feedback on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you'll see, you know, different requirements around PPAs and what's acceptable based on those incentives or based on those different certifications. So yeah, still working through, but as Ante said, really interested to get more feedback on that. So next question from Isaac. How does or can grid interactivity play into the program? From a greening the grid perspective to achieve greenhouse gas reduction targets regionally. Increasing grid interactivity for building loads through demand response equipment and programs is a key piece of the plan. Can adoption of grid interactivity be a factor? And that's a really interesting one as well. We're learning a little bit on that from some projects that are currently underway, like the PA living building. But really, I think that requires a lot more interaction with, you know, the jurisdiction and the utilities, and kind of understanding how are all of these things possible? How can we all kind of collaborate on what that might look like? I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's something that we still want to explore for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I would just add that that's a good example of something that some rating systems address, but looking at how other jurisdictions have kind of tackled these problems, if there's something that really matters to them, they'll add that as a requirement to a rating system requirement. So that's something that, you know, maybe if you have a really good idea about what that policy should be, even if it's not in a rating system, but it's pretty straightforward and can be documented through like a contract with utility, you know, send us your comments and we can kind of weigh in, can circulate that and get other feedback on it, but that could be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'd love to respond to those next questions.
The next one, Kay, Sharon, and Sarah. Yeah, do you want to go ahead and read it and then respond?
Sure. So some of these seem a bit anthropocentric. Any thoughts on how to keep other life on top of mind, i.e. making sure we're taking the effect on bird, salmon, and other life into account, and protecting whole ecosystems as we are a part of those? And that is fair. The way that we have explained this, it does focus on humans. And I would say when we look at rating systems like LEED and ILFI programs, especially Living Building Challenge Core and PEDAL certification, they do include a number of site criteria and other kind of ecosystem related criteria that is making sure that we're not negatively having impacts on birds, salmon, and other life. I think it is worth noting that we could look into how Salmon Safe fits in with our program. And then, of course, we would expect that buildings would be subject to existing policies on, you know, bird safe glass and other criteria like that. So
yeah, thanks, Alex. And I wonder, Paul, if you wanted to comment on any of that as well from Sustainable Northwest perspective.
Thank you. I think Sustainable Northwest, and some of the ways I think we would love to hear people's ideas for how to be inclusive of those ecosystem functions in general. My assumptions are that you start taking some of the goals around water and other sustainable building criteria that are pretty site specific, and make them about materials and make them about the ways in which the buildings are interacting with those external spaces. And we don't have a great, we would love to have people's ideas if people have seen other projects deal with that well. I think at this point we're brainstorming more than necessarily having the solution in front of us at this point, but certainly materials is where I would lean.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Another one from Annalie about whether or not we've looked at BREEAM used much more in Europe. We haven't. I think mostly because it isn't widely used here, but I think that that is certainly something we could consider. And then I want to jump also to these equity questions from Mark and Jackie. How are you addressing the potential for displacement gentrification that might be associated with such a policy? And also for any future developments as incentives, what are possibilities for any community benefit agreements that respond to create safeguards to ensure anti-displacement? So Kevin, do you want to take this one?
you're on mute.
Hi, and thanks for bringing up these questions. We have had a lot of discussions about displacement, gentrification, and this is being clear, it's in our focus. We don't have any solutions yet. What we think we need to do is engage a larger community conversation about this issue, and especially to include leadership in the BIPOC community and in communities that have real experience with this, so that we can find out what the root of the problem is and ways that we can ameliorate or prevent. There is a good science on anti-displacement. There's a lot of programs in Portland that are already starting to address this. One of the things we are trying to do with this program is to not create additional review and regulatory requirements for the city in order to be able to offer these incentives. So this still needs a lot of study, but it is clearly one of the most important factors that we're considering.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, and I think it's worth also adding to that. We are, with our steering committee group, planning on having a whole session focused on equity and bringing together a panel of community leaders together so that we can really deep dive into this specific issue, make sure that we're addressing it in a really inclusive way.
Yeah, thank you both. So I'm going to jump to the next question from Toy. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Feel free to correct me if you want. Should building reuse and retrofits be incentivized more than new builds somehow, perhaps with the carbon credit system? And I think that's definitely a question that has come up multiple times in a lot of our conversations and is still something that is being considered. But you know, there's a lot of conversation in general talking about that with the embodied carbon, but then also understanding what's kind of the outcome post-COVID as we see kind of a change in how people are using commercial real estate. So I think it's absolutely a question, and potentially that could be one way to incentivize, you know, making sure we maintain that embodied carbon that's already present without building new. And I want to hit Katie's question. I know we're getting close on time, but Katie says, finding partner banks willing to offer low interest rate loans for buildings that meet energy requirements may be a good option to look into. Defaults and foreclosures have been tied to high utility bills. So I'm going to open this one to Stephen and Kevin, if you guys want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a good idea, something we should explore more with the banks. You know, I think ultimately we're at a pretty early stage in aligning the incentives to the requirements. So I think that's kind of one of the next steps for us, is starting to run through the numbers, figure out what, you know, how the incentives add up and the value of those incentives, and then working to align them with the requirements. But that's definitely one of the possible tools. I know it wasn't actually on the chart that was shown, but that's definitely one of many tools that we can use to try and fund some of these requirements that we're pushing for.
This idea of having different kind of underwriting criteria for, at least for residential loans, based on energy efficiency, lower utility rates, and so forth, and changing the underwriting ratios and even interest rates for homes and buildings that have high energy efficiency is already being done in many places around the country. So there are models for this. It hasn't specifically been our goal to work with the banks, but I think that's a really interesting idea of how that intersectionality works associated with this program. So that's great input. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think we've covered the questions there, and we have about 5 minutes left. So I'll jump to our closing slides, but please feel free to continue adding questions and comments in the Q&A. If we don't have time to get to it today, we'll certainly follow up through email. And also, if you are interested in receiving updates from our group and understanding what engagement opportunities there are, please also drop your email in the chat. Feel free to do it privately to me if you don't want to put it in the chat open to everybody. That's fine as well. And we will be sure to follow up with you. So I'm just gonna jump here to this looking forward piece. So this is our kind of high level roadmap at this point. And what it really looks at is the stakeholder and community engagement, as well as the advocacy. We have had that kind of throughout the process. It's really core to the work we're doing, and will continue to be. And I'm starting to see some emails come in, so we'll integrate all of you into that as well. And we're looking forward to having more collaborators, more perspectives. And please feel free to share this widely with anyone you know who might also be interested in collaborating. We also note here the engagement with city bureaus. In the same way, we've engaged with folks at the city from the very beginning. They're still engaged, and we kind of keep them in the loop as to how everything's progressing, who we're talking to. You know, as we start to have some high level ideas, we share those for some general feedback, and we're looking forward to eventually getting some potential language in front of them to get, you know, kind of their gut take on what makes sense and what doesn't from what can actually be implemented. And I know I saw Vin on here, Sean Woods. I hope I didn't miss anybody. I think I saw Amanda Watson as well. So there's quite a few people who at the city been into working with us, and we've really appreciated being able to engage with city staff on that. And then, you know, these bars in the green are really talking about kind of what's our strategy or kind of general roadmap moving forward as far as how we're developing this policy. So where we're really at moving forward from here is we want to start, you know, drafting out these tiers, criteria, and incentives based on all the input that we're getting, and then eventually put that out for public comment so that we're hearing from everybody on what that looks like, getting as much feedback as we can, making sure that it really starts to you know, cover the goals, the outcomes that everyone's looking for in the community. So as many people as we can have comment on that is really key to this. And then I think from there, we start to reconcile that input from the public, from stakeholders, all of you that we're starting to hear from. So I'm excited to engage with all of you, the steering committee, city staff, and really start to kind of go through that iteration process of what a pilot policy might look like. And then eventually, where we get is hopefully to share that draft language recommendation with City Council and Planning and Sustainability Commission once we get to a place where we're all relatively happy with that. And so that's kind of generally the outlook. We don't have dates on here because all of this stuff kind of flows as it does, and you know, a totally volunteer organization. So we're all doing the best we can with the time we have to give, but yeah, it's certainly a goal, and we keep pushing, and there's a ton of momentum, and we see that here. You know, I think we're at 58 participants now. We were up close to 70 earlier, so yeah, really happy to see so many people interested in the work. And then how to get involved: join our email list. Everyone that we're collecting emails from here, we'll make sure to include you moving forward. And we'll follow up with any questions, you know, future language as it comes out, some updates, maybe even some follow-up poll questions based on what you saw here today. Spread the word with your networks. We want to keep growing who's contributing to this effort through those public comments, those community engagement pieces. Comment on draft language as it becomes available. We'll communicate that through the email list as well. And then eventually, hopefully we all get to show up and advocate and endorse the policy at some point. So that's kind of the moving forward piece. I know we're right at 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I just want to really thank everyone for joining us today. It's awesome to see so many people engaged, people who've been here from the very beginning. I love seeing your faces here too, and so many new folks as well. Anything else from the rest of the group before we sign off?
I just want to thank everyone for attending. We're so grateful for your time and your insights and any expertise or ideas that you're willing to share with us. We're really hoping that you'll join us in advocating for this policy to be passed as a pilot program for Portland, and hopefully the next year. I'll put an imaginary timeline on it. And we're just really excited about what the potential for this could be with all of your help. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone so much, and we'll be in touch. Looking forward to collaborating with you moving forward. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Amanda, don't leave the meeting.
Okay.
Paul, you're looking very Minnesotan with that beard and hair, buddy. It's like Paul Bunyan moved to Minnesota.
Yeah, Kelly keeps telling me she wants to cut my hair.
I don't think so.
That's what I told her.
Good job. Wow, you guys are humming along. That was amazing.
Yeah, thanks Terry, and thanks everybody. I'm impressed we ended on time. I wasn't sure that was going to happen.
Alex, I think you're muted.
Oh, yeah. Terry, do I need to do anything to close
I'm going to
out?
cut the recording now.
Okay.
And this is like record on this computer.
And I'm going to click save chat.
Okay,
so I make sure we don't lose everyone's email we just captured. And I'm just going to double check that we have that.
Hey, Benjamin, I'm reading Trees in Trouble. Paul's getting in next. Have you read that one, Paul?
It's a good one.
Oh, yeah. It's a really good one.
Cool. And I see we have, oh, sorry. Keep going,
No,
Terry.
sorry. We're hoping maybe during our next Sustainable Wood Story in December to maybe interview the author because he's a Portland guy. So,
what's the book called?
It's called Trees in Trouble.
Trees in
And
Trouble.
it's just trees and climate change and forest fires and shifting species and or manage or mismanagement of them. And it's I don't know. Benjamin turned me on to it. It's a bit of a deep dive. Maybe I do a chapter every 2 weeks so I can think about it because it's pretty dense. But it's also kind of approachable. It's not so scientific that it's good. It's good.
Awesome. And I want to acknowledge we still have Lee and Chuck. Did you guys want to chat or share anything? And Chuck, I know you've been in touch with Paul. You're both on mute if either one of you is trying to chat.
Amanda, you might need to stop the recording.
Oh, okay. Let me